The universe was not supposed to have room for hope. That was the first truth any scholar of the 41st millennium learned, whether they studied in the gilded academies of Holy Terra or scratched their lessons into the walls of a hive city underbelly. Hope was a currency that had been inflated into worthlessness across 10,000 years of unrelenting war. The imperium of man endured, not because it thrived, but because it was too stubborn, too vast, and too desperate to die. A million worlds bound together by faith, fear, and the light of a dying god on a golden throne, surrounded on all sides by Xenos that wanted humanity extinct, by traitors who had sold their souls to powers older than stars, and by a tear in reality itself that stretched across the galaxy like a wound that refused to close. The cicatrix maledictum, the great rift, the noctis aeterna. It had split the galaxy in two when the warp erupted with a violence that had no precedent in recorded history. Cadia had fallen. The Eye of Terror had swallowed half the known stars. Demons had walked on 10,000 worlds simultaneously, and the screaming of psychers across the Imperium had been so total, so overwhelming, that entire choir decks on Imperial warships had simply gone silent. Not dead, but emptied, their minds scoured clean by something too large and too hungry to comprehend. And then Robert Guilliman had returned, a Primarch, a son of the Emperor himself, resurrected by Eldar sorcery and his father's fading will, dragging the Imperium back from the precipice through sheer organizational genius and the kind of stubborn pragmatism that made even chaos blink. The Indomitus Crusade had pushed back, a reclaimed, reinforced. New Space Marines walked the battlefields, Primaris warriors taller and deadlier than their predecessors. The Imperium bled, but it held. It always held. That was the tragedy of it. No one on any world, in any faction, was watching the rift on the night the light came through. It happened in the spaces between reality and the warp, in the dimensional membrane that separated the material universe from the howling sea of psychic energy that the ruinous powers called home. The rift had torn that membrane so thoroughly that reality itself had become porous in certain regions, places where warp storms bled into real space without warning, where the laws of physics bent like heated metal, where time moved sideways instead of forward. In these bleeding-edge territories, strange things occasionally slipped through. Mostly demons, occasionally something worse. What came through on that night was neither. It had no body, no singular voice, no face that could be seen or name that could be spoken in any language the Imperium possessed. It was an energy, a field, a presence, a living current that moved not through the warp but alongside it, the way a river runs beside a road without ever merging with the dust. Where warp energy was hot and hungry and screaming with the emotions of every living thing that had ever suffered or raged or despaired, this was something else entirely. It was quiet, it was patient, and it was, in the most literal and terrifying sense of the word, alive. The Force had entered the 41st millennium. Its arrival was not an explosion. It was not a fleet dropping from orbit or a chaos incursion cracking the sky open with demonic light. It was subtler than that, and subtlety, in a universe of constant, overwhelming violence, was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. It seeped into real space the way dawn light seeps under a door, gradually then all at once, touching everything it reached with a gentleness that the galaxy had utterly forgotten how to recognize. On Fenris, the Space Wolves' remaining psychers, their rune priests, those weather-hardened warriors who read fate in bones and storm patterns, felt something brush the edges of their consciousness and jerked upright in the middle of the night, hands reaching for weapons that could not fight what they were sensing. It was not the warp. It was not a demon. It was not the cold, calculating touch of Xenos' psychic intrusion. It was something they had no framework for, something that felt, impossibly, like standing in a forest and knowing without seeing that something ancient and peaceful was watching from between the trees. On Prospero's ruins, a single surviving Thousand Suns rubric marine, little more than animated armor and trapped soul dust, stopped walking in the middle of a desolate plain and stood perfectly still for 6 hours. Inside the armor, The barely coherent fragment of consciousness that remained felt something reach toward it, not to consume, not to command, simply to acknowledge. The fragment had not been acknowledged in 4,000 years. On 1,000 other worlds, psychers wept without knowing why. And on Holy Terra itself, deep beneath the imperial palace, in the sanctum sanctorum where the god emperor of mankind sat dying and eternal on his throne of gold and agony, something changed. The astronomers who monitored the emperor's psychic emanations through their instruments, crude things, inadequate things, but the best humanity could manage, recorded a spike in output unlike anything in the last 3 centuries. Not the desperate burning flare of a mind fighting to hold the Astronomicon together. Something different. Something that looked, if the readouts were to be believed, almost like recognition, almost like relief. The Inquisition's sensors across the segmentum solar lit up simultaneously. Alarms that had not sounded since the Siege of Terra's aftermath began screaming in vaults that most Inquisitors didn't know existed. And in his private sanctum aboard the Macraga's Honor, Robert Gilliman set down the 17 reports he had been reading simultaneously and turned toward the viewport facing the direction of the rift. He had not survived 10,000 years in stasis, a resurrection, and the relentless horror of the 41st millennium by ignoring his instincts. Something had changed. In a universe where there was only war, something had arrived that did not, at its core, want war at all. And that, in the grim darkness of the far future, was the most alarming thing anyone had ever detected. If you want to see more crossovers between universes pushed to their absolute limits, hit that subscribe button and drop your crossover idea in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The Golden Throne had not changed in 10,000 years. That was the official position of the Adeptus Custodes, the golden armored warriors who had guarded the Emperor's dying form since the end of the Horus Heresy. It had not changed because it could not change, because any alteration to its impossibly complex systems risked collapsing the psychic beacon that kept the Astronomicon burning and the warp routes open across the Imperium. Tens of thousands of psychers were fed into it every single day. Willing sacrifices, condemned criminals, broken souls from the black ships. Their life energy consumed to keep one shattered mind alive and one galaxy from drowning in darkness. The custodians understood their vigil. They did not question it. They did not measure it in hope. Captain General Trajan Valoris had stood his watch for longer than most Imperial commanders had been alive. And in that time, he had seen the Emperor's condition fluctuate in ways that the Mechanicus cogitators could measure, but never explain. Moments of increased output during great battles, subtle shifts during the deaths of Primarchs, the catastrophic surge during Cadia's fall that had burned out 3 entire monitoring stations and driven their operators permanently insane. He had cataloged all of it with the meticulous discipline of a warrior who understood that he was guarding not just a body, but the last ember of humanity's greatest fire. He was not prepared for what happened in the deep hours of the watch cycle, when the throne room was at its quietest, and the only sounds were the rhythmic, mechanical breathing of life-sustaining apparatus and the distant, perpetual, psychic hum that the Emperor's presence produced. The hum changed. Nay, it was not louder. It was not more urgent. If anything, it became momentarily quieter, the way a man who has been groaning in pain might suddenly go silent when something distracts him from his suffering. Valoris was on his feet and moving before the thought had fully formed, his guardian spear leveled at nothing, his enhanced senses scanning every corner of the chamber for a threat that his instruments could not find. There was no threat. There was instead light. Not the sickly golden radiance that permanently suffused the throne room, that ancient, desperate glow that spoke of power being burned at a rate no human mind could truly comprehend. This was different. It appeared at the edges of the throne itself, in the spaces between the mechanisms and the ornamental metalwork, in the gaps between what had been built by human hands and what had grown organically from 10 millennia of psychic output. It was pale and cool and moved the way water moves when it finds the path of least resistance. Not forcing, not burning, simply flowing. Valoris did not lower his weapon, but he did not attack. The throne's monitoring systems, never designed to detect anything except warp energy signatures and biological deterioration, registered nothing. The cogitators processing the Emperor's psychic output showed the same baseline readings they had shown for 300 years, with one exception. One small, extraordinary exception that the junior tech priest monitoring Station Tertius almost dismissed as instrument error before his training kicked in and he began screaming for his superiors. And the Emperor's brain activity, measured in the crudest possible terms by sensors that could only approximate what was happening inside a mind of literally incomprehensible power, had shifted from its characteristic pattern of total, consuming focus toward a single overwhelming task. For 10,000 years, the readout had looked like a star going supernova in slow motion. Constant, total. Every fragment of consciousness devoted entirely to holding the Astronomicon together, to fighting the demons that perpetually clawed at the throne from the warp side, to simply surviving one more day in a death that was not death. Now, for the first time in recorded Imperial history, it looked like something else. It looked like a mind paying attention to two things at once. The light that had entered the throne room moved with a patience that seemed almost deliberate, navigating the impossible psychic geography of the Emperor's presence the way a careful traveler navigates a minefield. Not in fear, but in respect. It recognized the scale of what it was approaching. The Force, in its long existence across its own galaxy, had touched many minds and many lives in many moments of great darkness. It had flowed through Sith Lords and Jedi Masters, and terrified farm children on desert planets, and dying soldiers on forgotten battlefields. It had learned over billions of years of existence the difference between darkness that consumed and darkness that endured. What sat on the golden throne was not a warp entity. It was not a demon in a cage or a weapon pointed at the sky. Yeah, it was something the Force recognized in the way that one river recognizes another river. Different waters, different paths, but the same fundamental nature. Something that had once been wholly alive, that had dedicated itself entirely to protecting other living things, that had been paying a price for that dedication so enormous and so long that the cost had become indistinguishable from the entity itself. The Force did not heal the Emperor. It was not capable of that, not yet, not in this strange and hostile universe where the warp contested every inch of psychic space, but it did something that 10,000 years of Imperial faith and Mechanicus ingenuity had never managed. It touched him gently, and it stayed. In the throne room, the pale light settled around the golden throne like a second atmosphere, thin and quiet and utterly unlike anything the warp produced. Valoris watched it for 6 minutes before he made the communication he had hoped never to make. The one reserved for events that had no category, no protocol, no precedent in the vast imperial bureaucracy of crisis management. He called Guilliman directly. The Primarch answered on the second pulse, which told Valoris that he had already been awake, already watching his own instruments, already aware that something had fundamentally shifted in the fabric of the galaxy he was trying desperately to hold together. "You've seen it," Valoris said. It was not a question. "I've seen the readings," Guilliman replied. His voice carried the particular quality it always carried. The exhausted precision of a man who had read too many reports about too many catastrophes and had learned to treat each new impossibility as simply another problem to be solved. But underneath that precision, Valoris heard something he had not heard in the Primarch's voice since the early days of the Indomitus Crusade. Uncertainty. And beneath the uncertainty, buried so deep that only someone who had served beside a Primarch could detect it. Something that might, against all evidence and reason, be the first trembling outline of wonder. "It's not the warp," Guilliman said. "No," Valoris agreed. "It is not." The silence between them lasted exactly 4 seconds. A geological age for two beings of their capability and temperament. "I want every Inquisitor with Malleus clearance briefed within the hour," Guilliman said finally. "And Valoris, tell no one what the throne room reading showed. Not yet." The Captain General understood immediately. In the Imperium of Man, a miracle was rarely just a miracle. It was also a weapon, a political crisis, and a theological earthquake waiting to happen. Whatever had touched the Emperor in the small hours of that watch cycle, whatever had made the most powerful and most broken mind in human history momentarily turn its attention outward, it needed to be understood before it could be weaponized, suppressed, or worshipped. All three were inevitable. The only question was the order. The planet had no name worth keeping. It had been called Vorane IV once, in the early days of Imperial expansion. Yet when some optimistic rogue trader had looked at its rust-colored continents and breathable atmosphere and seen potential. That potential had lasted approximately 40 years before a chaos incursion had turned it into a demon world, swallowing the colonial infrastructure whole and replacing it with the organic, nightmarish architecture that the ruinous powers preferred. Towers that grew like tumors, rivers that ran with something thicker than water, skies permanently bruised purple and green by the warp energy bleeding through every crack in reality. The Thousand Suns had claimed it 3 centuries ago. It suited them. The planet's warp saturation made it an ideal location for sorcerous work that required sustained psychic environments. The kind of deep, patient rituals that Magnus the Red's warrior specialized in. They were not a warband given to the explosive, joyful violence of Khorne's followers or the rotting patience of Nurgle's faithful. They were scholars of the impossible, librarians of forbidden knowledge, sorcerers who had traded their humanity for an understanding of the warp's deepest mechanisms, and who would tell you, if you asked, that the trade had been entirely worth it. Ahriman was not present on Vorane IV when it happened, which was fortunate. His absence meant that what followed was witnessed by sorcerers of sufficient power to understand what they were seeing, but insufficient authority to immediately act on it in ways that would have accelerated the crisis by several weeks. The ritual in progress was a standard resonance mapping exercise, the Thousand Suns equivalent of taking a compass bearing. By saturating a warp-connected location with carefully structured psychic energy and measuring the return signatures, experienced sorcerers could map the local warp topography, identify demonic territories, locate hidden psychic phenomena, and chart safe corridors through the immaterium for fleet movements. It was meticulous work. It was the kind of work that separated the Thousand Suns from every other Chaos warband in the galaxy. The insistence on understanding, rather than simply using. Sorcerer Adept Katathos had been conducting resonance mappings for 200 years. He knew every signature type in the catalog his legion had assembled over 10 millennia of obsessive study. Warp storms had distinctive patterns, chaotic, fractal, self-similar at every scale. Demonic presences left heat signatures in the psychic spectrum, bright and hungry and patterned with the particular flavor of whichever ruinous power they served. Blank spots indicated null psychers or certain types of Xenos technology. Eldar psychic interference produced elegant, crystalline interference patterns that were aesthetically beautiful and tactically infuriating. He had no category for what his instruments found at the third resonance point of his mapping grid. It appeared as an absence first, a region approximately 3 kilometers in diameter where the expected warp energy returns simply didn't come back. Not a blank spot, not a null psycher suppression field, something more sophisticated than either. The warp energy was reaching the region and being gently, firmly redirected. The way water redirects around a stone, not because the stone fights the water, but because the stone simply is, with a certainty that water cannot argue with. Katathos ran the measurement 4 times, each time the same result. He brought in 2 additional sorcerers, ranking members of the Corvidi cult, whose specialty was detection and precognitive analysis. They confirmed what he was seeing and added their own observations. The region was not static, it was growing. Slowly, with extraordinary patience, it expanding outward from a central point at a rate of approximately 2 meters per hour, and within it, their scrying attempts produced not darkness or static, or the angry psychic feedback that chaos-tainted regions typically generated. They produced something that none of the 3 sorcerers had words for. The closest Katathos could come, in his report to the warband's senior ranking officer, was to describe it as the feeling of standing in a place where nothing bad has ever happened. He immediately recognized how inadequate that description was, struck it from his official report, and replaced it with precise technical measurements that conveyed the same information in language that wouldn't make him sound like he'd been mind-wiped. The measurements told the story more accurately anyway. 0 warp corruption index, 0 demonic resonance, 0 psychic trauma scarring in the local environment, despite the planet's 3-century history as a demon world. Within the Force Nexus, though none of them used that term, having no access to it, the land itself was beginning to change. The twisted architecture of chaos growth was retreating from the boundary, not explosively, but steadily, the way mold retreats from light. The ground within the region had lost its unnatural color. Grass was growing. Simple, unremarkable grass, the kind that grew on 10,000 imperial agricultural worlds and had no business existing on a planet that had been warp-saturated for 300 years. Small things, quiet things. The Force was not announcing itself. It was simply being, and its being was incompatible with corruption at a fundamental level. The Thousand Sun sorcerers stood at the boundary and stared at the grass. Then the senior ranking officer, a towering warrior sorcerer named Sakathis, whose psychic power was significant enough that lesser beings experienced spontaneous nosebleeds in his presence, made a decision that was simultaneously professionally reasonable and catastrophically unwise. He stepped across the boundary. His warp sight went dark immediately. Not painfully, not violently. It simply ceased, the way a torch ceases when you carry it into bright daylight. Not extinguished, just rendered temporarily unnecessary by the presence of something more fundamental. The sorcerous enhancements that the Thousand Suns wore like a second skin, the psychic augmentations woven into their armor, and their neurology over centuries of careful cultivation, all of them went quiet at once. He was standing in his power armor, physically formidable by any standard, and he was, for the first time in 200 years, simply a man. He stood very still. Around him the grass moved in a wind that had no meteorological explanation. The sky above the Nexus was different from the sky outside it. Less bruised, less heavy. The purple-green taint fading towards something approaching natural blue at the very center. And in that center, visible now that he was inside the boundary, and his warp-altered perception had been temporarily replaced with something cleaner, was a light source. Pale, patient, utterly without menace. Sakathis was a warrior of chaos. He had given 10,000 years of study and sacrifice to the pursuit of knowledge through the warp. He had crossed moral lines that would make most human beings catatonic with horror, and he had done so willingly in the name of understanding. He stood in the quiet grass, in the fading light of a corrupted sky slowly becoming less corrupted, and felt something brush his consciousness with a gentleness that the warp had never, in all his centuries of immersion in it, ever managed. He felt seen, not judged, not consumed, not measured for usefulness. Simply acknowledged, the way the Force acknowledged all living things, completely, without condition, without agenda. It lasted approximately 4 seconds before his training reasserted itself, and he stepped back across the boundary, his sorcerous senses flooding back with a disorienting rush. The warp's familiar hunger and noise returning like a crowd noise after a moment of unexpected silence. He stood outside the boundary for a long moment. Then he sent a priority communication to the planet of sorcerers, marked with the highest level encryption the Thousand Suns possessed, addressed personally to Magnus the Red. The subject line contained only 4 words. He needs to see this. Inquisitor Valdris Thane had personally overseen the execution of 37 psychers in the last month alone. Now, this was not unusual. By the standards of the Ordo Malleus, it was practically a quiet period. The Cicatrix Maledictum had flooded the galaxy with warp energy in concentrations that were triggering psychic manifestations in populations that had previously shown no sensitivity whatsoever. Farmers on agri-worlds suddenly screaming in tongues, children in Hive City scolums drawing diagrams of demon geometries they had no way of knowing. PDF troopers on garrison duty spontaneously combusting during routine inspections. The Inquisition was stretched across a million worlds trying to contain, categorize, and where necessary eliminate the overflow, and Thane had not slept more than 4 hours consecutively in 8 months. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the wrong man to handle a phenomenon that required patience and open-minded inquiry. He was also, by the Ordo Malleus's own assessment, exactly the right man to handle a phenomenon that might represent an existential threat to the Imperium's psychic stability. Thane had built his career on a single, uncompromising philosophical position: that the warp was the enemy, that every manifestation of psychic power was a door that something hungry might walk through, and that the only truly safe psyker was a dead one, with the regrettable exception of those whose abilities were so useful to the Imperium that the calculus of risk shifted marginally in favor of keeping them alive and heavily monitored. He was not a stupid man. He was not a cruel one, by his own lights. He was a man who had watched chaos consume everything he had ever cared about on a world called Solathus Prime when he was 19 years old, and who had spent the subsequent century ensuring that no other world suffered the same fate on his watch. The briefing he received from Guilliman's office arrived without warning, classified at a level that required 3 separate authentication rituals and the physical presence of a custodian to transmit. Thane performed all 3 without complaint and read the contents twice methodically, the way he read everything, looking first for what was stated, then for what was omitted, then for what the omissions implied about the sender's state of mind. What was stated, an unidentified psychic phenomenon of non-warp origin, had been detected across multiple locations simultaneously. It appeared to be expanding. It had been confirmed at throne room proximity. Guilliman wanted it investigated, categorized, and a threat assessment delivered within 72 hours. What was omitted? Any mention of what the throne room readings had shown. Any mention of the Emperor's altered brain activity. Any mention of the pale light that Valoris's personal report, which Thane had obtained through channels that Guilliman didn't know he had, described in the throne room itself. What the omissions implied, Guilliman was frightened, not of the phenomenon itself necessarily, but of what it meant politically and theologically if the wrong people learned about it before it was understood. The Adeptus Ministorum would declare it a miracle. The Mechanicus would declare it a contamination, when the more radical elements of the Inquisition would declare it chaos by default and begin burning everything in proximity to it. Any of these responses, deployed prematurely, would transform a mystery into a catastrophe. Thane agreed with Guilliman's caution, which he noted with mild irritation since he preferred to disagree with Primarchs on principle. It kept the relationship appropriately adversarial. He assembled a team of 6, 2 of his most trusted acolytes, a sanctioned psyker whose survival instincts Thane had personally tested on 3 separate occasions, a Mechanicus Magos whose expertise in anomalous energy signatures had proven reliable where others had not, a Sister of Silence whose null field would provide a psychic buffer during investigation, and a Primaris Space Marine liaison from the Nova Marines whose presence was partly tactical and partly political. Having a Space Marine on the team would discourage the more aggressive branches of the Imperium from interfering before Thane had what he needed. They translated to the nearest confirmed nexus point in 48 hours, a location in the Segmentum Obscurus where 3 separate monitoring stations had reported simultaneous anomalies consistent with the throne room phenomenon. The system was lightly inhabited, a single mining colony on an unremarkable moon that had been sending increasingly confused reports about atmospheric changes, vegetation growth in the sterile processing zones, and mining servitors that had stopped responding to directives and were instead standing motionless in their work bays. The sensor arrays pointed toward a single location in the colony's lower levels, as though listening for something. Thane arrived expecting a contamination zone. He arrived expecting warp taint dressed in unfamiliar clothing, because in his experience, that was what unknown psychic phenomena always turned out to be. He arrived with his hand near his weapon and his sanctioned psyker's inhibitor collar primed for emergency shutdown. He was not prepared for the smell. The lower levels of a mining colony smelled like every other industrial facility in the Imperium. Promethium, metal shavings, recycled air thick with particulate matter, the undertone of human occupation that no filtration system ever fully eliminated. Thane had been in hundreds of them. He knew the smell the way he knew the weight of his bolt pistol. The nexus point didn't smell like that. It smelled like rain on dry earth, like forest undergrowth after a storm, like growing things in a place where nothing was supposed to grow. It was so jarringly, impossibly natural that Thane stopped walking 3 meters from the entrance to the lower bay and simply stood there, breathing, while his rational mind fought to categorize the sensation, and his hindbrain did something it had not done in decades. It relaxed. He overrode the response immediately, professionally, with the practiced discipline of a century's training. But the Magos beside him was already running scans, and what she was reading made her mechadendrites curl inward in an involuntary gesture that Thane had learned to recognize as her equivalent of open-mouthed astonishment. "Inquisitor," she said, her voice carefully modulated to maintain the flat affect of Mechanicus protocol despite the data screaming through her augmetic processors. "These readings are not possible." "Clearly they are," Thane said. "Report." "The energy field present in this location is psychic in nature," she said. "It is not warp-derived. It is not Xenos in any pattern I have on record. It is not a null field. It does not suppress psychic ability. It appears to redirect it. Psyker-generated warp signatures entering the field's radius are being gently decoupled from their warp source, and—" She paused. For a Magos, a pause of that duration was the equivalent of a lesser human being dropping their instruments and sitting down on the floor. Rerouted through something else, something that runs parallel to the warp without intersecting it. Behind Thane, his sanctioned psyker made a soft sound. The Inquisitor turned. The psyker, a young man named Karos whose abilities had been leashed and monitored and carefully rationed for the entirety of his adult life, who had grown up understanding that his gift was also a door and that doors required locks, was standing with his eyes closed and tears running freely down his face. His inhibitor collar, Thane noted with a spike of alarm, was still active. It was doing its job. The warp connection was still suppressed, but something else had found him anyway. Something that didn't need the door the collar was locking. "Karos," Thane said sharply, "report your status." The psyker opened his eyes. They were clear. Present. Not the glazed, distant look of warped touch. Not the manic brightness of possession. It's not the flat emptiness of a mind being consumed. Simply clear and wet with tears he seemed embarrassed by but not frightened of. "It's not the warp, sir," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man reporting observable fact. "I don't know what it is, but it's not the warp." He hesitated. It feels like it's been looking for something for a very long time, and it's not entirely sure it's found it yet, but it's—" Another hesitation. "It's glad to be here." Thane stared at him for a long moment. Then he activated his personal Vox bead and began composing the most carefully worded threat assessment of his considerable career, because whatever this was, it was going to upend everything. And in the Imperium of Man, things that upended everything had a historically poor survival rate. The Farseers of Craftworld Ulthway did not panic. Panic was a luxury afforded to species that had not seen the full arc of their own civilization's collapse, written in the psychic residue of a catastrophe 10,000 years in the making. The Eldar, those who remained, those who had survived the fall by fleeing onto their great Craftworld ships, or retreating into the webway, or selling pieces of their souls to a deity of death, had long since burned through their capacity for the kind of existential terror that lesser species experienced when confronted with something genuinely unprecedented. What they had instead was worse in its own way. They had perspective. Farseer Eldenarial had been reading the skein of fate for 600 years. The skein was the Eldar term for the psychic web of possibility that their seers navigated. An ocean of potential futures, branching and converging, lit by the psychic weight of pivotal moments and darkened by catastrophes yet to occur. Navigating it required a particular kind of mind, disciplined enough to observe without drowning, intuitive enough to distinguish signal from noise, and experienced enough to know that the most significant futures were rarely the loudest ones. The apocalyptic visions, the ones that screamed and burned and demanded attention, were often distractions. The quiet ones, the subtle shifts in the skein's fundamental texture, those were the ones that changed everything. Eldenarial had felt the Force's arrival before it happened, not as a vision, not as a specific prophecy, when as a change in the quality of the skein itself, the way a musician might sense a change in the acoustic properties of a hall before a single note is played. Something had altered in the deep structure of psychic possibility, something fundamental and far-reaching, and she had spent 3 days in silent meditation before she understood enough of what she was sensing to call a council. The council chamber of Ulthway was a place of severe beauty, curved wraithbone walls that resonated with the psychic energy of their occupants, casting soft bioluminescent light that shifted color with the emotional tenor of the discussion. 7 Farseers sat in the traditional formation, their runestones arrayed before them, their minds carefully linked in the partial communion that allowed coordinated skein reading without the dangerous intimacy of full psychic merger. Eldenariel laid out what she had found without preamble. The skein had changed because something had entered the galaxy that the skein had no existing pathways to accommodate. It was not a new warp phenomenon. The skein had frameworks for those, however terrible. It was not a Xenos psychic manifestation. There were templates for those as well. The cold mathematics of Necron dimensional engineering, the crystalline precision of Tau warp blindness, the wet hunger of Tyrannid hive mind approaches. This was none of those things. This was a psychic energy that operated on principles the skein had never encountered, because as best as Eldenariel could determine, it had never existed in this universe before. The oldest Farseer present, a being named Tarathaniel, who had survived the fall itself as a young child and carried the trauma of it in every line of his ancient face, said nothing for a long time after her presentation. When he spoke, it was in a dialect of Eldar so archaic that 2 of the younger Farseers required a moment to parse it. "I have heard of this before," he said. Every eye in the chamber turned to him. Tarathaniel's runestones moved without his touching them, arranging themselves in a pattern that none of the others recognized. Something from a period of Eldar history so ancient it predated the formal tradition of skein reading itself. In the epoch before the fall, when our civilization stretched from one arm of the galaxy to the other, and our psychers were the most powerful beings in existence, our most ambitious seers attempted to pierce the dimensional barriers between this universe and others. Not to travel between them, simply to observe, to understand whether the principles of the warp were universal or particular to this galaxy's reality. He paused. The wraithbone walls had shifted to a color that Eldenariel associated with cautious reverence. Most of what they found was darkness, Tarathaniel continued. Other versions of the warp, other psychic wastelands, other hungry things. But in one direction, in a dimensional bearing that our ancestors described as fundamentally different from all others, in that it did not feel like looking outward, but rather like looking sideways. They found something that defied their frameworks entirely, a psychic field of extraordinary scope and penetration that permeated an entire galaxy the way the warp permeates ours, but without the warp's corruption, without its hunger. Alive in a way that was entirely unlike demonic life, not consuming, not territorial, not driven by the emotional residue of suffering. The chamber was absolutely silent. "They called it the etheric constant," Tarathaniel said, "because unlike the warp, which shifts and roils and changes with every act of emotion and will, this field was consistent, stable, present in every living thing it touched without distinction. The powerful and the powerless, the righteous and the corrupt, the dying and the newborn. Our ancestors spent considerable time debating its nature, whether it was a natural phenomenon or a constructed one, whether it was conscious or simply pervasive, whether it could be communicated with or only observed." "What did they conclude?" Eldenariel asked. Tarathaniel's expression shifted into something that the younger Farseers couldn't quite categorize. On a less ancient face, they might have called it longing. "They concluded that it was the single most extraordinary thing they had ever encountered," he said. "And then the fall happened, and the records were lost with everything else. And no one has thought about the etheric constant in 10,000 years. The council absorbed this in silence. Then the youngest Farseer present, Alathaniel, barely a century old by Eldar reckoning, whose skein reading was raw and powerful, and occasionally embarrassingly accurate in ways that made her elders uncomfortable, spoke up with the particular directness of someone who had not yet learned to dress her observations in diplomatic language. If our ancestors found it by looking sideways, she said, and it's now here, then it found us by looking sideways too. It came here deliberately. She paused. Or something brought it here. And if the warp couldn't corrupt it when our ancestors observed it from a distance, the question isn't whether the warp will try. She looked around the council. The question is what happens to the warp when it does. The wraithbone walls shifted again. This time the color had no established emotional association in the Farseer tradition. It was something new, something the chamber had never expressed before. Eldenariel decided, after a moment's consideration, that it looked like the first light of a dawn that no living Eldar had ever seen, because it was the color of something genuinely, terrifyingly unprecedented. It looked like the color of a future that hadn't been written yet. She immediately dispatched 3 ranger teams to the nearest confirmed force nexus coordinates and composed a message to the Harlequins nearest Shadowseer. Because whatever was coming required the kind of information network that only the followers of the Laughing God could provide across the full breadth of the galaxy. She also privately did something she had not done in 200 years of Farseer discipline. She allowed herself for exactly 4 seconds to hope. Then she put it away and got back to work. The boy's name was Devon Orell, and he had been dying for 6 hours. This was not unusual for a scout attached to the Ultramarines Vanguard forces operating in the contested zones around Vigilus. The planet had been a war zone for long enough that dying slowly was practically a rite of passage for the mortal auxiliaries who fought alongside the Adeptus Astartes. Soldiers who were brave enough and skilled enough to earn a place in the most dangerous theaters of operation, but who lacked the transhuman physiology that allowed a space marine to survive wounds that would kill ordinary humans 3 times over. Devan had taken a last bolt through his lower torso during a skirmish with a Wordbearer's warband 2 days ago, and the field medici had done what she could, but the wound had been touched by warp energy before it was sealed, and warp-touched wounds had a particular tendency to resist conventional treatment in ways that the Mechanicus could measure but not fully explain. He was lying in a makeshift medici station in the ruins of a manufactory district, conscious enough to be uncomfortable and not conscious enough to be afraid, which his attending medici had privately decided was the most merciful state available to him. She had given him what she could. She had logged him as critical, non-recoverable. So as she had moved on to the patients she could still help, because that was what triage demanded. And triage was the only moral framework that made sense in a place where the wounded outnumbered the healers by 30 to 1. Devon was aware of the light before he was aware of anything else. It came without announcement. The way he imagined sunrise came on worlds that still had normal day cycles. Gradually, then completely, filling the space around him with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He was not a psyker. He had no particular sensitivity to the warp or any other psychic phenomenon. He was a 19-year-old boy from a hive city on Ultramar who had joined the Vanguard Auxiliaries because it had seemed, at the time, like a better option than the manufactorum. When he had no framework for what he was experiencing, and therefore experienced it with a directness that more sophisticated observers would have found both enviable and heartbreaking. It felt like being held by something that had no hands but understood entirely what hands were for. The wound closed over the course of 40 minutes, not explosively, not with the dramatic cellular acceleration of a Space Marine's enhanced biology or the crackling energy of a Mechanicus healing device. Slowly and thoroughly, the way a healthy body heals when given sufficient time and resources. Except compressed, guided, the biological process is running with a precision and gentleness that no medici instrument could have achieved. The warp corruption in the wound simply ceased, not burned out, but quietly, completely resolved. The way a misunderstanding resolves when the correct information finally arrives. When the attending medicae returned to log Devon's death, she found him sitting up. The report she filed triggered 17 separate alarms in the Ultramarines' intelligence apparatus on Vigilus, and within 4 hours the information had been compressed, encrypted, and transmitted to the Macraga's honor via the fastest courier drone the Vanguard Forces commander could requisition. Roboot Gilliman read the report standing at his strategy table, surrounded by the ongoing holographic cascade of 100 other crises demanding his attention, and was very still for a very long time. He had been a Primarch for 10,000 years, counting the time in stasis, and in that time he had encountered most of the things the galaxy could produce. He had fought demons and Xenos and the worst of his own brothers. He had been resurrected by means that he still found theologically and philosophically uncomfortable to contemplate. He had watched the Imperium he had helped build calcify into something his father would not have recognized, and he had set himself the task of reforming it with the full knowledge that the task was probably impossible, and the certain knowledge that impossible tasks were still worth attempting. He had not in all of that time encountered a verified miraculous healing that carried no warp signature whatsoever. The theological implications alone were staggering. The Adeptus Ministorum's entire doctrinal framework rested on the premise that miracles, genuine psychic interventions that defied normal physical law, were the exclusive province of the Emperor's divine will, channeled through the faith of his servants. The Sisters of Battle built their entire combat philosophy around this premise. The Ecclesiarchy's political authority derived in significant part from its claimed monopoly on imperial miracles. A miracle that had nothing to do with the Emperor's will, or did it, was either a profound confirmation of something or a devastating challenge to everything. And Guilliman, who was constitutionally incapable of approaching theological questions with the comfortable certainty that faith provided, could not immediately determine which. He called for Brother Sergeant Ethan, with the Primaris Ultramarine, who had been serving as his liaison with the Vanguard forces on Vigilus. Ethan arrived within minutes. A towering river, black-armored and precise, whose temperament Guilliman had always appreciated for its lack of dramatic flourish. "You've read the report," Guilliman said. "Yes, Lord Guilliman." "Your assessment." Ethan was quiet for a moment, which Guilliman respected. A lesser officer would have filled the silence with immediate certainty. "The Medicis instruments are reliable. Devon Orell's wound was warp-touched and critical. The healing cannot be explained by any mechanism I have encountered or been trained to recognize." Another pause. "I spoke with the boy directly before transmitting the report. He was coherent, not possessed, not psychically altered in any measurable way. He described the experience as—" Ethan stopped. "As what?" Guilliman said. "As feeling less alone than he had ever felt in his life," Ethan said, with the careful neutrality of a man reporting something he found personally significant and was professionally uncertain how to categorize. Guilliman turned back to his strategy table. The holographic displays showed the galaxy in its current state, the rift burning across the center, war zone indicators clustered like wounds, fleet movements and supply lines, and the 10,000 ongoing emergencies that constituted normal Imperial operations in the 41st millennium. He thought about a boy sitting up from his deathbed. He thought about the throne room readings. He thought about what it meant in a universe defined entirely by the grinding, merciless mathematics of loss. For something to arrive that healed without cost, without corruption, without the terrible transactional logic that governed every other form of power the galaxy contained. Then he thought about what chaos would do when it understood what was growing in its territory. Then he thought about what the Inquisition would do when it decided it had enough data to act. Then he sent for Inquisitor Thane, because what he needed right now was not wonder or theological debate. What he needed was someone who understood exactly how quickly a miracle could become a massacre and how to prevent it. The force was growing. The galaxy was noticing. And the things that ruled the dark spaces between stars were not, in Guilliman's considerable experience, inclined to tolerate competition. Whatever this light was, whatever it meant, it had approximately no time at all before every faction in the galaxy was moving toward it with weapons drawn. He intended to be there first. Magnus the Red arrived alone. This was, by any tactical assessment, an act of extraordinary arrogance. The planet of sorcerers was 3 warp translations away from Vorane IV, and the journey through the Immaterium was never safe, never predictable, never entirely survivable for beings of lesser capability. Magnus made it in 11 hours, which was not a record, but was close to one, traveling through the warp the way only a Primarch could. Not navigating it, but imposing his will upon it, his psychic presence so vast and so forceful that the warp's native currents simply yielded rather than contest him. He materialized on Vorane IV's surface at the edge of the Force Nexus boundary and stood there for a long moment, his single eye, the other lost to a bargain with Sinch that had seemed reasonable at the time, and had cost him everything he valued, taking in the sight with the particular quality of attention that characterized Magnus above all other Primarchs. Where Guilliman saw problems to be solved and Leman Russ saw enemies to be fought, Magnus saw things to be understood. It was his greatest virtue and the root of every catastrophe he had ever caused. The Nexus had grown since Sakathas's report. It now covered nearly 8 kilometers of Vorane IV surface, and the transformation within it was no longer subtle. The demon world architecture had retreated completely from the interior, leaving behind ground that looked impossibly like a meadow, green and quiet and entirely wrong for a planet that had been chaos-saturated for 3 centuries. The sky above it was genuinely blue at the center, fading to the planet's characteristic bruised purple only at the edges, as though the Nexus and the Warp were engaged in a slow, patient negotiation about where one ended and the other began. Magnus studied the boundary for 12 minutes without moving or speaking. Then he stepped across it. His experience was different from Sakathas's. Where the sorcerer adept had felt his abilities simply cease, Magnus felt something more complex. A pressure, a resistance, a sense of the force examining him the way a careful craftsman examines a piece of material before deciding how to work with it. His psychic abilities didn't shut down. They changed. Were the warp-derived elements of his power, the taint of Tzeentch that had woven itself into his sorcery over 10 millennia of service to the changer of ways, those went quiet, but something else remained. Something he had not used in so long that he had nearly forgotten it existed. The part of him that had been born a psyker. The pure original psychic sensitivity that had made him the most powerful of the Emperor's sons before the fall of Prospero, before the heresy, before 10,000 years of choices that had calcified one by one into a path he could no longer clearly remember choosing. That part of him the Force did not suppress. That part the Force touched with something that felt, though he distrusted the word immediately, like recognition. He stood in the meadow and felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely calculate, like himself. Not Magnus the Red, Daemon Primarch of the Thousand Suns, architect of the rubric, servant of Tzeentch, lord of the planet of sorcerers. Not the being who had broken his legion trying to save them, who had destroyed Prospero trying to warn his father, who had made every wrong choice for every right reason across an existence measured in catastrophes. Simply Magnus, the scholar, the reader, the mind that had once looked at the universe with pure, uncompromised curiosity and seen only wonder. He sat down in the grass. This would have been, to any observer who knew his reputation, the single most alarming thing he had done in 10,000 years. Magnus the Red did not sit in meadows. However, Magnus the Red brooded on crystalline thrones in towers of impossible geometry on a planet outside normal space. Magnus the Red conducted rituals of devastating complexity and fought wars across multiple dimensions, simultaneously and occasionally accidentally destroyed things he was trying to protect. He did not sit quietly in grass that shouldn't exist on a demon world and simply breathe. He sat for 40 minutes. What happened during those 40 minutes was not, strictly speaking, a conversation. The Force did not speak in words. It had no voice, no agenda, no specific message to convey. What it did was simpler and more devastating. It allowed Magnus to be present, fully and without the constant psychic static of Tzeentch's influence, with his own memories. Not the filtered, justified versions he had been maintaining for 10 millennia. The actual ones. Prospero burning, his sons screaming. The Emperor's face at the moment their minds had met in the warp, and everything had gone irreversibly wrong. The rubric that had saved his warriors' souls and imprisoned them simultaneously. Every choice and its consequence, present all at once without the warp's characteristic habit of turning memory into fuel for rage or despair. He simply remembered, and the Force held him in the remembering without letting him drown in it. When he stood up, his expression had changed in a way that no Thousand Sons warrior would have recognized, because it was an expression none of them had ever seen on his face. It was not the fierce intellectual excitement he wore when pursuing knowledge, nor the cold fury he wore in battle, nor the complicated grief he wore in private moments when he thought no one was watching. It was clarity. He walked to the center of the nexus, where the Force's presence was strongest, where the blue sky was deepest and the grass was greenest and the sense of something vast and patient and alive was most concentrated. He stood there and looked up at the sky for a long time, his enormous form utterly still in the meadow that had no right to exist. Then he said quietly to the sky, "I know what you are." The force did not answer in words, but the light shifted, the way light shifts when something that has been waiting a very long time finally receives the acknowledgement it has been patient for. "You're what the warp was supposed to be," Magnus said, before the emotions corrupted it, before the pain and the fear and the rage turned it into what it is. "You're what a psychic field looks like when it isn't built on suffering." The grass moved in its inexplicable wind. Magnus was quiet for a moment. Then, and this was the thing that would have frightened every faction in the galaxy if they had been present to witness it, he laughed. Not the cold, dangerous laugh of a being who has found an advantage. A genuine laugh, surprised out of him. The laugh of a being who has spent 10,000 years certain that something irreplaceable was gone forever, and has just discovered it still exists. "My father knew," he said, and his voice had changed completely, the Primarch's commanding resonance replaced by something younger and more raw. "He knew something like you existed. That's what he was building toward. That's what the Imperial truth was actually about. Not the atheism, not the rejection of the warp, but this, a humanity connected to something that doesn't consume them." He paused. He just ran out of time. He stood there for another long moment. Then the clarity in his expression hardened into something purposeful, because Magnus was still Magnus, regardless of what the Force showed him about himself, and clarity without purpose was just another form of grief. "Tzeentch will come for you," he told the light quietly. "All four of them will. They'll sense what you represent. A psychic field that doesn't feed into the warp, that doesn't generate the emotional currency they run on, and they'll understand that if you grow large enough, you'll starve them." He paused. "I know how they think. I have spent 10,000 years in service to one of them, and I understand their methodology completely." The Force light moved around him, patient and present. "I can help you," Magnus said. "Not out of altruism. I gave that up a long time ago. But because what you are is what I have been trying to find since before the heresy. The proof that my father's vision was possible." He looked at his hands. Enormous, red, the hands of a warrior and a sorcerer, covered in the accumulated metaphysical weight of 10 millennia of terrible choices. "And because Tzeentch does not deserve to win, not this, not you. Above Vorane IV, undetected by the Warband's orbital sensors, because it was running full stealth protocols and had been designed by the most paranoid intelligence apparatus in the Imperium, an inquisitorial black ship held position and recorded everything. In its command sanctum, Inquisitor Thane watched the feed from the drone he had inserted into the nexus boundary 3 hours ago and felt the cold, absolute certainty of a man whose worst fears have just been comprehensively confirmed. A demon Primarch had just offered his services to an unknown psychic entity of non-imperial origin. In a universe where there was only war, this qualified as a declaration of it. The Chaos Gods did not experience time the way mortals did. For beings whose consciousness spanned the entirety of the immaterium, whose thoughts moved through 10,000 years of past and future simultaneously, whose very existence was woven from the psychic residue of every emotion, every living thing in the galaxy had ever produced. When the concept of being caught off guard was essentially meaningless, Tzeentch knew all possible futures. Nurgle had already accepted all possible outcomes. Khorne cared only for the blood that would eventually flow regardless of circumstance. Slaanesh tasted every sensation across every timeline simultaneously. And yet, something was happening in the material universe that all four of them were finding, in their own incomprehensible ways, deeply uncomfortable. The Force had been present in the galaxy for 11 days when the warp began to react. It started at the edges. Subtle distortions in the emotional currents that fed the Chaos Gods their power. The way a river's flow changes when something large is placed upstream. The currents didn't stop. The fear and rage and despair and excess that 10 billion human lives generated every single day continued to pour into the immaterium with the reliable consistency of 10,000 years of unbroken suffering. But at the points where force nexuses had established themselves, the flow changed, thinned. The emotional energy was still being generated by the living beings in proximity to those locations, but it wasn't reaching the warp with the same purity of corruption it normally carried. It was being touched by something else first, not consumed, not redirected to another source, simply met, the way a person in crisis is met by a steady presence. And that meeting changed the quality of the emotion, took the sharpest and most warp-nourishing edges off it, or transformed raw despair into something that still carried sadness, but also carried the possibility of endurance. Raw rage into something that still held anger, but also held the possibility of justice. The chaos. Gods were not being starved, but they were being, in the most literal and theologically significant sense possible, diluted. For beings whose power was absolute and whose appetites were infinite, dilution was the functional equivalent of starvation. Tzeentch moved first, because Tzeentch always moved first and usually moved last, and frequently moved in directions that other entities only recognized as movements after the fact. The Changer of Ways had known about the Force's arrival before it happened, had in fact, it's incorporated it into 17,000 separate contingency plans spanning multiple possible futures, but had made the characteristic Tzeentchian error of assuming that knowledge of a thing constituted control of it. Now watching the Force grow through the lens of its impossible multidimensional awareness, Tzeentch began to reassess. The reassessment took approximately 4 seconds of subjective chaos God time, which translated to about 6 hours of real space activity as Tzeentch's servants across the galaxy began receiving new instructions simultaneously. Ahriman felt the shift before he received the instructions. He was aboard his flagship, the Photep, translating through the warp toward Vorane IV after receiving Magnus's transmission. A message of such compressed and careful language that only Ahriman, who had known his Primarch for 10,000 years, could read the genuine urgency underneath the intellectual framing. Magnus had found something important. Magnus wanted Ahriman there. These two facts combined were sufficient to make Ahriman drop everything else immediately, because in 10 millennia of service to the most complicated being he had ever known, Magnus's genuine urgency had only ever preceded events of galaxy-changing significance. The warp around the Photep shifted. It was subtle at first, a change in the current's direction, the kind of navigational complication that experienced Thousand Suns pilots handled routinely. Then less subtle. The warp was thickening around them, becoming viscous and resistant in a way that had a specific signature Ahriman recognized from previous encounters. Something very large was paying attention to their destination. He went to the observation deck and looked into the warp directly, something most beings avoided because looking into the warp directly had a tendency to look back. His wards held. His vision penetrated the churning psychic medium and found what was causing the resistance. The warp was moving toward Vorane IV like weather moving toward a coastline. Not a single directed force, but a broad environmental shift. The immaterium itself mobilizing in the way it mobilized when the Chaos Gods decided that something required their collective attention. He had seen this happen twice before in 10,000 years. Once before the destruction of Prospero. Once before the fall of Cadia. Both times the thing the warp had mobilized against had been destroyed. Ahriman turned from the viewport and began issuing orders with the crisp efficiency that had made him the most capable commander in the Thousand Suns history, and some would argue, the most dangerous sorcerer in the galaxy. He sent a priority transmission to Vorane IV, compressed to a single encrypted word that would tell Magnus everything he needed to know about the timeline they were working with. The word was now. On Vorane IV, Magnus received it and felt the warp shift simultaneously and understood immediately. He was standing at the nexus boundary, having spent the last several hours in a state of focused, productive thought that he hadn't experienced in centuries, working through the implications of the Force's nature, its mechanics, its potential, with the way he had once worked through problems in the libraries of Prospero before the universe had narrowed his existence to warfare and survival. He reached into the nexus and felt the Force respond to his presence, that same quality of patient recognition it had offered him since his arrival. He had been thinking carefully about what he wanted to say to it, because Magnus understood that how you framed a request determined whether the answer was yes. "They're coming," he said. "All four of them, or their significant servants. The warp is mobilizing." He paused. "You need to understand what that means. The Chaos Gods don't send armies first. They send the warp itself. They will attempt to corrupt you at your foundation, to introduce their emotional signatures into your field until you're indistinguishable from them. Hamid Zench will try to make you into another current of the immaterium. Nurgle will try to make you into entropy. Khorne will try to make you into fury. Slanesh." He stopped. The force light had changed. It was still the same pale, patient luminescence, but there was something different in it now. Not fear. The force seemed constitutionally incapable of fear in the warp nourishing sense, but awareness, a heightening of attention. The force was listening to him with a focus that it hadn't brought to their earlier exchanges, and he understood that he was telling it something it didn't know about the specific mechanics of this universe's darkness. "Slanesh will try to make you into addiction," he finished, "into something that feels like the force but requires constant feeding and causes constant harm. That is the most dangerous corruption vector, because it would be invisible from the outside until it was too late." The light moved around him, processing. "I can teach you how to resist them," Magnus said. "Not through force. You don't have that kind of power yet. And even if you did, fighting the Chaos Gods directly is inadvisable for reasons I can elaborate extensively upon from personal experience. Through structure, through deliberate, careful psychic architecture that makes corruption mechanically impossible." He paused. "It's essentially what the rubric was trying to do for my warriors. Seal the soul against outside influence. When I failed them because I didn't have the right principles to work from." His voice carried something that, in a lesser being, would have been called regret, but in Magnus had the quality of a structural assessment, honest, precise, without self-indulgence. "You are the right principles. I have the methodology. Together." The nexus boundary behind him flared suddenly. Not with force light, with something else entirely. A crack in real space that split the air like a wound, bleeding the purple-green light of raw warp energy, and through it came the first of Tzeentch's heralds. A lord of change, vast and many-eyed and luminous, with impossible geometry, its presence in the material world causing reality to visibly strain around it. It looked at Magnus. Magnus looked at it. "Ah," said the Lord of Change, its voice the sound of 1,000 possibilities collapsing simultaneously. "The Crimson King. Tzeentch suspected you'd be here." Its many eyes moved to the Nexus light. And there it is, the anomaly, the foreign constant. Its beak curved in something that functioned as a smile. "Tzeentch sends his regards, and his appetite." Behind it, 3 more warp tears opened. Magnus turned back to the force light and said, with the clipped urgency of a being switching from philosophy to combat, "I need you to trust me, not blindly. I am not asking for blind trust. I have seen enough of those transactions to know what they cost. But I need you to let me show you the architecture, now, before they reach the Nexus core." The force light was still for exactly 1 moment. Then it moved toward him like a tide coming in. Not engulfing, not overwhelming, but surrounding, present, available in a way that it had not been before. An offering of collaboration rather than surrender. A living field making a considered choice. Magnus closed his eye and began to work. Above Vorane IV, Ahriman's fleet dropped from the warp in a cascade of light and immediately opened fire on the demonic incursion. Below, in a meadow that shouldn't exist, a demon Primarch and a living force of nature began building something together that neither the Imperium nor Chaos had any framework to understand. In the warp, all 4 Chaos Gods turned their attention fully toward a single point in the material universe for the first time in 10,000 years. And on Holy Terra, every monitoring instrument in the throne room spiked simultaneously as the Emperor of Mankind, dying and eternal and silent for 3 centuries. "I did something that Valoris had no category for." He pushed back. The signal reached Guilliman 17 minutes after it left Terra. 17 minutes was fast by the standards of Imperial communication, the result of a dedicated relay chain that the Adeptus Custodes maintained for exactly this category of emergency. a chain whose existence was known to approximately 9 people in the entire Imperium, and whose activation protocols had not been used in living memory. Valoris had composed the message in 4 words, because 4 words were sufficient, and Valoris was not a man given to elaboration when precision served better. The Emperor is acting. Gilliman read it once, set it down, and in the 12 seconds before he began issuing orders, he allowed himself something he almost never permitted. A moment of completely unguarded reaction, unmediated by strategy or responsibility, or the exhausting necessity of appearing certain for the benefit of the 10,000 people whose courage depended on his composure. In those 12 seconds, he felt the full weight of what was happening settle onto him with a clarity that was almost physical. His father was acting, not sustaining, not enduring, not performing the passive, agonized function of a mind reduced to a single desperate purpose by 10,000 years of unrelenting sacrifice. Acting, reaching outward, deploying will toward a specific external object, doing the thing that the shattered remnant of the greatest human mind ever produced had not done since the siege of Terra ended and the Golden Throne became a prison. Something had given the Emperor enough of himself back to move. Gilliman was already walking when the 12 seconds ended, issuing orders to his command staff in the rapid, layered cadence that his officers had learned to parse at full speed. 3 simultaneous conversations, each receiving his complete attention, none interfering with the others. He wanted the Macraga's honor translated to Vorane IV within the hour. He wanted Inquisitor Thane's black ship on an intercept course, but under orders not to engage anything without his direct authorization, a restriction he expected Thane to violate and had already planned for. He wanted every available Primaris company in the Vigilus theater redirected to Vorane IV with sealed orders that would only be opened on his command. He wanted a communication channel open to Craft World Ulthway, a request that would baffle his communications officers and which he would explain later. He wanted, and this was the order that caused the most visible consternation among his staff, a channel open to the planet of sorcerers. His equerry, a veteran ultramarine named Sextus, who had served him without complaint through 6 years of the Indomitus Crusade, paused for exactly half a second before repeating the order back for confirmation. Gilliman confirmed it. Sextus relayed it without further comment because Sextus understood that there were moments when a Primarch's reasoning operated several steps ahead of available explanation, and that demanding the explanation before executing the order was the kind of thing that lost battles. The channel predictably produced no response from the planet of sorcerers. Magnus was not there. But Ahriman was, coordinating the fleet engagement above Vorane IV from a secondary command position, while his flagship ran fire support on the demonic incursion. He received Gilliman's communication with the particular quality of attention of a being who has just been handed an unexpected variable and is already calculating its implications at high speed. He did not respond immediately. He spent 40 seconds in visible deliberation, which Gilliman could observe through the channel's visual feed, and then said something that under any other circumstances would have been the most diplomatically explosive statement of the century. Lord Gilliman, what are your intentions regarding the nexus? Gilliman, who had prepared for many possible opening gambits, had not prepared for 1,000 Suns arch-sorcerer cutting directly to the only question that actually mattered. He recalibrated instantly. Preservation. What are yours? Another pause. Shorter. The same. A beat. Magnus is inside the nexus. He has been for 8 hours. He is currently building psychic architecture to protect the force field's core from chaos corruption. Ahriman's expression was difficult to read through the channel's compression, but Gilliman, who had spent 10,000 years learning to read the faces of beings far less human than Ahriman appeared, detected something unexpected. Not calculation, not the careful management of a negotiator, revealing only what served his purpose. Something closer to the truth. He is succeeding, but the chaos incursion is larger than my fleet can contain indefinitely. I have 3 hours before the demonic pressure exceeds our suppression capacity. Gilliman absorbed this. You're asking for Imperial reinforcements. I am informing a Primarch of a tactical situation, Ahriman said carefully. What he does with that information is his concern. How very precise of you, Gilliman said, with a dryness that made Ahriman's expression shift fractionally towards something that might have been involuntary appreciation. I'll be there in 90 minutes. Do not let the nexus fall. He closed the channel and felt the weight of what he'd just committed to settle into place alongside everything else he was carrying. He had just implicitly agreed to fight alongside the Thousand Sons, against demons, to protect something that was healing Imperial citizens and touching the Emperor's consciousness, and growing in the spaces between warp corruptions like a plant growing through stone. The Inquisition would have opinions. The ecclesiarchy would have louder ones. The political fallout would take years to manage. He found he could not locate the part of himself that cared. The Macraga's honor translated to Vorane IV system in 88 minutes, which was 2 minutes ahead of Gilliman's stated timeline, because his navigator had pushed the Geller field to margins that would require full recalibration afterward, and his helmsman had understood implicitly that this was not a journey where caution was the priority. They came out of the warp into a system already burning with engagement. Ahriman's fleet fighting a three-dimensional holding action against a demonic incursion that had grown substantially in the 90 minutes since their conversation, warp tiers opening faster than they could be suppressed. Lords of change and bloodthirsters and worse things pressing against the boundary of real space with the focused intensity of entities that had received specific instructions from specific gods. Gilliman assessed the tactical situation in 4 seconds and began issuing fleet orders that transformed the engagement geometry entirely. The Macraga's honor's firepower and the disciplined precision of the ultramarine fleet elements he'd brought folding into Ahriman's defensive formation with a seamlessness that should have been impossible given that they had never trained together and were, by every formal categorization, mortal enemies. It worked because good tactics were good tactics regardless of who was executing them, and both Gilliman and Ahriman were, whatever else they were, extraordinarily good at this. On the surface, inside the nexus, Magnus felt the orbital engagement shift and knew Gilliman had arrived without needing confirmation. He had spent 8 hours in the most focused, productive work of his existence, building psychic architecture into the force field structure, the way a craftsman builds load-bearing elements into a structure, invisible from the outside but fundamental to whether the whole thing stands when pressure is applied. The Force had been the most extraordinary collaborator he had encountered in 10,000 years of working with psychic entities. It didn't impose, it didn't demand. It simply responded to what he built with a perfect comprehension of his intent. Filling in the spaces his methodology left open with its own nature in ways that improved the overall structure beyond what either of them could have achieved independently. He was almost finished when the nexus shook, not from the demonic pressure outside. Ahriman's fleet and now Gilliman's were holding that boundary. From inside, from below, from the deep structure of the force field itself, where something was pressing upward with a force that the external architecture he'd been building wasn't designed to manage because it wasn't an attack from outside. It was an arrival from elsewhere. Magnus opened his eye, the one that saw in spectrums ordinary vision couldn't reach, and looked at what was coming up through the force field's foundation, and was very still for a moment that contained within it a complete reassessment of everything he thought he understood about what was happening. The Emperor's consciousness was moving through the Force, not a fragment, not a carefully rationed expenditure of the minimal psychic capacity the throne room instruments could measure. Something larger, something that felt, to Magnus's perception, like watching a man who has been buried alive finally break the surface and take a real breath. When the Golden Throne's hold on that consciousness had not released, the Emperor was not free. The Astronomicon still burned, the warp ward still held, the 10,000 years of desperate, grinding, agonized function continued without interruption. But alongside all of that, traveling through the force field the way water travels through a pipe that has just been opened, was something that Magnus had not felt since a night on Prospero when everything had ended. His father's actual attention, not the overwhelming, burning, desperate psychic presence of the Emperor maintaining the Astronomicon and fighting off demonic intrusion and performing the 1,000 other impossible tasks that kept the Imperium alive. Something distinct from all of that, a remainder, a fraction of the most powerful human mind ever produced, Moving through the force with the careful, wondering attention of a being discovering for the first time that a door it had given up on opening was, in fact, open. Magnus stood in the meadow and felt his father's attention move through the force field, touching everything within it, taking in the grass and the blue sky and the simple, impossible fact of clean air on a demon world, and then moving further, outward through the force's growing network of nexus points, touching the mining colony where Devon Orell had been healed, touching the throne room where Valoris stood watch, touching the 1,000 other places where the force had quietly, patiently been doing what it did, learning what it was. Magnus, who had not cried since Prospero and had no intention of starting now, he became aware that his vision was blurring and addressed the problem with the same methodical discipline he applied to everything. Then the Emperor's attention found him specifically, and every discipline he possessed became temporarily insufficient. It was not words. It was not the thunderous, psychic communication of a Primarch's mind meeting his father's across a direct link. It was more fundamental than language. Recognition, the kind that moves faster than thought, the kind that knows before it understands. And within that recognition, moving so quickly that Magnus almost missed it, something that his 10,000 years of guilt and grief and the elaborate intellectual structures he'd built to manage both of them were completely unprepared for. Forgiveness was too simple a word for it. Absolution was too transactional. What the Emperor's fractional attention communicated in the space of 2 seconds, moving through the force with a gentleness that the warp had never permitted between them, was something closer to, I know, I always knew, and none of it changed what you are to me. Magnus stood in the grass for a very long time after the Emperor's attention moved on, continuing its exploration of the force field's reach. Above him, the sky was the deepest blue it had ever been on Vorane IV. Around him, the psychic architecture he had spent 8 hours building hummed with a stability that would hold against anything the chaos gods could send, because it had been built from the right principles and filled with the right nature, and some structures, once properly made, simply did not break. Outside the nexus boundary, Sorna, the demonic incursion was being systematically dismantled by a fleet engagement that would be studied in tactical academies for centuries, conducted by a Primarch regent and an arch-sorcerer who had never met and were never supposed to cooperate, and who were currently doing so with a wordless, furious competence that was reducing a Class Omega demonic incursion to manageable remnants in real time. And in the warp, all 4 chaos gods felt something shift in the fabric of the material universe, something settle into place with a permanence that their appetite and their malice and their infinite patience had not managed to prevent, and understood, with the clarity available only to beings of their scope and intelligence, that they had lost something today that they would spend the next 10,000 years trying to recover. The force had taken root. The meeting happened 3 days after the battle in the meadow. Guilliman had insisted on the location specifically, overriding his security staff's objections, with the kind of quiet finality that Primarchs deployed when they had already heard the argument and found it insufficient. The Nexus was the only place where what needed to happen could happen, and the security concerns, while legitimate, were subordinate to the necessity of the conversation. He arrived with a custodian escort of 6 and left them at the boundary, stepping across alone, because some conversations required the absence of weapons. Magnus was already there, sitting in the grass with the particular stillness of a being who has recently undergone something that rearranged his interior landscape and is still mapping the new terrain. And he looked up when Guilliman crossed the boundary and said nothing, which Guilliman respected by also saying nothing for the first 30 seconds, standing in the meadow and feeling the force settle around him the way it settled around everyone who entered the Nexus. That quality of complete, unconditional acknowledgement that no amount of intellectual preparation quite prepared you for. He had expected it to feel threatening. He had expected his considerable defenses to register it as something requiring assessment and management. Instead, it felt like setting down a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it wasn't part of his body. He sat down across from Magnus, which required a conscious decision to override the instinct of 10,000 years of war. "You saved it," Guilliman said. "We saved it," Magnus corrected, and with a precision that was not false modesty, but genuine accuracy. Your fleet engagement bought the time the architecture needed to set. Without that, he paused. The Chaos Gods were 3 hours from corrupting the core, 4 hours from making it indistinguishable from the warp. He looked at Gilliman with his single eye, and Gilliman, who had faced demon Primarchs in battle and understood exactly what he was sitting across from, found that the eye contained something today that it hadn't contained in any account he had read of Magnus the Red. Something settled. Something that had been burning for 10,000 years and had finally, without extinguishing, found the right shape to burn in. You made a decision that will cost you politically for years. Yes, Gilliman said simply. You did it anyway. The alternative was losing something that healed a dying boy and made my father move for the first time in 3 centuries, Gilliman said. The political cost is manageable. The alternative was not. Magnus was quiet for a moment. Then, he found me in there. Gilliman said nothing, but his expression changed in a way that conveyed everything necessary about how carefully he had been trained not to show what he felt. I am not asking you to trust me, Magnus said. I understand the architecture of what I am in your taxonomy. Heretic Astartes, Demon Primarch, Servant of Chaos, Enemy of the Imperium. Well, I have no illusions about which category I occupy in your strategic calculus, and I have no expectation that one conversation in a meadow changes 10,000 years of accumulated consequence. He looked at the force light moving quietly around them. But I know what I built in there. I know its structure and its principles and what it will need to continue growing, and I know what the Chaos Gods will do next, because I know how they think, and I know what they fear, and I know the specific vectors they will use to attack something that represents this level of threat to their power base. And you want to tell me, Gilliman said. I want to tell someone who can use the information, Magnus said. You are the most capable administrator and strategist in the Imperium. Whatever you think of my methods or my history, yeah, that assessment is accurate and we both know it. He paused. The Force needs advocates in the Imperium, people who understand what it is and will prevent the Inquisition from burning it in a purge before anyone comprehends what's being lost. Gilliman thought of Thane, of the 17 alarms Thane had already filed, of the formal Ordo Malleus investigation request that was sitting in his administrative queue requiring his authorization to proceed, which he had not yet provided, and which Thane was becoming increasingly pointed about. That is already a significant problem. It will become a larger one, Magnus said. The Force will begin manifesting in psychers who've had nexus exposure. Not warp-derived ability, genuine Force sensitivity, the same field but expressed through individuals rather than locations. When the Inquisition encounters the first Imperial citizen who can move objects without touching the warp at all, the institutional response will be lethal, Gilliman said. Reflexively, yes. Magnus looked at him. You need doctrine. You need a framework that categorizes Force sensitivity as distinct from warp corruption, that gives the Inquisition a protocol other than execution, that creates space for these individuals to exist and develop without becoming either casualties of Imperial paranoia or recruitment targets for chaos. He paused. My father was building something like that before everything ended. The Librarius protocols had elements of it, imperfectly implemented. You have the administrative capability to build it properly. Gilliman sat with this for a long time. The meadow was very quiet around them. Somewhere in the middle distance, a bird was singing. An actual bird on a demon world, because the Force nexus had been here long enough now that life was finding its way back to soil that chaos had held for 3 centuries. He watched it without speaking, and Magnus let him watch it, and the Force moved around both of them with the same patient, unconditional presence it brought to everything. The Eldar will want involvement, Gilliman said finally, thinking of Eldenariel's ranger teams that his scouts had located and quietly observed rather than engaged. Their Farseers remember something called the etheric constant, ancient records from before their fall. I know, Magnus said. Tzeentch's archives contain the same records. The Force has been here before, in a manner of speaking, or something like it. He paused. Yaki, the Eldar's involvement is complicated but not impossible. They have motivation to protect it that aligns with Imperial interests, even if nothing else about them does. "And you?" Gilliman said. "What does Magnus the Red want from this?" The question landed in the meadow and sat there, and Magnus looked at it with the honest attention of a being who had spent 10,000 years giving dishonest answers to that question, and found the habit suddenly exhausting. "I want to finish what I started in there," he said, gesturing toward the Nexus Center. "The architecture I built will hold, but it needs refinement. It needs someone who understands both the force's nature and the warp's mechanisms to maintain the boundary between them as the field expands." He paused. "I want to do something with the knowledge I've accumulated that doesn't end in catastrophe. I am aware of how that sounds coming from me." "It sounds like my father," Gilliman said quietly, "which is either the most reassuring thing you could have said or the most alarming." Magnus looked at him for a long moment. "Perhaps both." Gilliman stood, and Magnus stood, and they looked at each other across the grass of a meadow that had no right to exist. Two beings who between them carried enough history and consequence, and impossible complexity to fill libraries, standing in the quiet light of something that had traveled across the dimensional boundary between universes and found, in the darkest galaxy imaginable, the one thing it could still recognize: life, trying its best. Gilliman extended his hand. Magnus looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough that Gilliman wondered whether the gesture was going to be refused. Long enough that the refusal would have been entirely understandable, and then took it. Above the meadow, the sky was the deepest blue that Vorane IV had ever shown. In the warp, the Chaos Gods raged and schemed and prepared their next approach, because they were patient and eternal, and the loss of one battle in 10,000 years of war was simply a variable to be incorporated into the next plan. They would send more servants. They would find new vectors of corruption. They would press against the force nexus from every direction simultaneously, and they would not stop because they were incapable of stopping. Because stopping was not a concept that beings of their nature possessed. But the architecture would hold. And in the deep throne room of the imperial palace, surrounded by the sound of machinery and sacrifice and 10,000 years of desperate grinding endurance, the Emperor of Mankind felt the force moving through the network of nexus points across his galaxy, like water moving through a root system. And for the first time in longer than any living being could remember, the psychic emanation his instruments recorded carried something that was not only desperate, burning purpose. It carried the faint, extraordinary signal of a mind that had found, in the deepest darkness, a reason to hold on. Not victory, not yet. Not for a long time, perhaps not in any timeline that any farseer could clearly read, but something that the grim darkness of the far future had run out of 10,000 years ago and had been running on the memory of ever since. Something worth fighting for. The Force had not saved the 41st millennium. It had not ended the Great Rift or silenced the Chaos Gods or resolved the 10,000 ongoing catastrophes that constituted normal existence in the grim darkness of the far future. The Imperium still bled across a million worlds. The demons still clawed at the boundaries of reality. The war that had no end continued exactly as it always had, because some things were too large and too old and too deeply embedded in the fabric of a universe built on suffering to be resolved by any single miracle, however extraordinary. But something had changed. In the meadows that were slowly, what impossibly spreading across what had been Vorane IV's demon-corrupted surface, in the mining colony where Devon Orell had walked out of a Medici station that had logged him as non-recoverable, in the throne room where monitoring instruments recorded a signal that no doctrine had words for, in the hearts of psychers across the Imperium who had felt something brush their consciousness and found that the warp's hunger felt, for the first time, like something they could resist. Something had changed. The Force did not promise victory. It did not offer salvation on the terms that 10,000 years of imperial faith had defined salvation. It offered something older and simpler, and in its own way more radical than any theological framework the ecclesiarchy had ever constructed. It offered the galaxy the knowledge that it was not alone in its darkness, that something vast and patient and genuinely, fundamentally alive had found its way here and chosen to stay. That the living and the struggling and the enduring mattered, not because of their utility to an empire or their service to a dying god, but because they were alive, and life in any universe was the Force's most fundamental concern. In the shadows, the Chaos Gods were already planning,